This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. February 2026 is in the bag, and Mike and I are going to talk about what happened this month. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here.
So, starting off, I think the big thing for any February, this February, last year's February, next year's February, is the manager's rollout of the operating budget for FY2027. I think every meeting in February had some component of it, whether it was the February 4th workshop where he walked through what is in the budget, how the budget is put together, and what the process for adopting the municipal budget is. And then certainly on the 11th, a week later at the regular meeting, there was the rollout, the actual 900-page gorilla. And then the 18th, as we talked about here and as we've recapped, the executive, school, planning, finance, and public welfare budgets were presented. And then finally on the 25th, there was a public hearing for the school portion of the budget.
Right.
So March will bring more of that fun. But I think that really is the keystone of a February, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the big task for the council. And obviously that consumed a lot of what they did in February and will in March and into the beginning of April when they are expected to vote on the proposed FY2027 budget.
Yeah.
So,
what other highlights do you think, from the council at least, on February's docket? One highlight definitely is the return of milfoil. They discussed it in January. They revisited it in February at the February 11th city council meeting. They essentially adopted a provision to encourage the manager to apply for the grant, but then they stopped short of actually accepting and expending the grant. Right. Because they want staff to go, they being the council want staff to go and look at alternatives that might not require a herbicide.
Well, the bid did go out for that and seeking the least toxic option available.
Yeah, and I know there was talk about using a diver. I think it's called the DASH method, and it certainly could be an option. It'll be interesting to see the quality and quantity of responses we get.
Getting back to the budget real quick, we talked about the budget workshop, which was the first workshop they held at their first session in February. And in addition to getting the primer on the budget, they also had a discussion about the TIF district, right? And it may be worth mentioning because it's a significant part of the discussion we're having right now related to the budget. What we're talking about when we're talking about the TIF, and we're talking about the downtown TIF.
Right. That's a good point. We have two TIF districts in the city, the downtown and the waterfront. The downtown was put in place to finance the parking garage. And the two-line explanation of a TIF is it is investing public funds to help spur private redevelopment, and the value improvements on the property that private redevelopment occurs on fund the debt service payments on the public infrastructure. So in this case, because we've seen so much growth around the parking garage, there has been a overperforming enhanced valuation of the downtown by about $102 million based off the original pro forma. This was a 25-year payoff, and there is enough funding come July to actually pay the parking garage off 13 years early. Or, and this is where it ties into your budget comment, the council can say, we have enough in the fund balance to pay the parking garage off, even if it was that we still make payments for another 20 years or 13 years. But the way the TIF was written, anything above that, so in this case, $3.1 million in FY27, could get returned to the general fund. I think the manager, in proposing that, is looking to investigate what it would mean to curtail the TIF, pay off the debt and the TIF, and show what that general fund tax valuation would increase by.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, and the manager mentioned this, I think at the workshop, but also I think as part of his presentation to the council when he unveiled the proposed budget. You know, it takes a little bit of courage when the TIF district is set up.
Yeah.
You know, certainly on behalf of the council, because you're making an investment in the future that you obviously hope is going to pay off. And in this case, it took some courage to do that. And obviously, we're seeing the dividends of that now.
Absolutely. And I think it's good to provide the caution that a couple of the counselors did, that the waterfront TIF can be there. It's not there now. And just like the downtown TIF had some catch up to do early on, because you are putting more financial drain on the accounts than revenue going in, because it's at early stages. But the waterfront TIF is doing exactly what it was intended to do. And when we get into a higher payback mode, which should be coming now that there's occupancy in Building C, the mixed-use building, and in the townhouses on the waterfront, we should start seeing a lot more equity being built and a lot more positive situation for the waterfront TIF. That said, I think we need to recognize, as the manager pointed out, we are over-succeeding in the downtown TIF, meaning we were conservative when we came up with the numbers, because it's better to be Scotty and over-deliver and under-promise. And that was the intention there, was what was the minimum, so that if we had a bad route, we would be able to be protected, because we got to protect the public interest in the public's fiduciary requirements.
Right. Yeah, and I suspect we may talk a little bit more about the waterfront later on, and what the waterfront committee is up to. But looking back at, other work by the council beyond the budget, because, as you said, we'll be back next month talking about the budget again.
Right.
The council did take some other action. At their meeting on the 25th, they approved the FY2027 Community Development Block Grant Action Plan.
It did. And that, it's interesting, because that used to be timed more with the budget. Now it's sort of tangential, even though it theoretically is part of the budget. But you're right. The planning board has been working on applications for the Community Development Block Grant Program since October. And Dave Carpenter, who is our staff, who manages that program, he has been working with applicants to refine their applications, go to the planning board. The planning board acts as the sounding board, the advisory board in this case. And they've made a recommendation, and then the council unanimously approved that on the 25th. From here, there's a 45-day comment period, and HUD will take that into account. And then typically, and this is one of the reasons why we now do these in February as opposed to March, April, typically we want to have all of the contracts with the recipients of the funding in place well before July 1.
Right.
So that July 1, we get the check from HUD, or we have the ability to draw down the money from HUD. We can just dole it out to the groups that have requested it.
Compared to previous years, how does it compare for FY 2027? We've seen maybe what we receive from HUD diminish a little bit over the years.
So I remember a high of about $600,000. That was probably 20 years ago. Then for a long time, we were at like 275. I think we're at 3.25. There was some additional funding put into the program maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and we've been pretty stable at that. We have program income we can collect and put in, and that's been pretty stable for about 20 years. We don't do the types of programs that create a lot of income.
Right.
Our goal is to give grants or to give direct aid, not to create a revolving loan or create a revenue source, mainly because the reporting that's required, the accounting that's required. We learned when it was at 275 that the additional effort and requirement was not efficient for the additional gain of that program income. The program income went from like $6,000 to $10,000.
Yeah.
And that additional $4,000, while nice to be able to give out, was not worth the additional bureaucratic morass that we had to endure.
Right. Yeah.
But there was a time, I would say when I first became the planning director, 15 to 20% of my pay and all of the block grant coordinators' pay was paid for by the grant.
Yeah.
Now, 20% of Dave's pay goes to that.
That's it.
It's a very different landscape.
Yep.
And just from a historical perspective, it's worth noting, by and large, the formula that the federal government uses to provide these block grant funds to communities is the exact same formula that was put in place in 1974. So it's still looking at age of the housing units, the decrepitude of the housing units, things of that nature to drive who gets what, which ironically is why Portsmouth gets the most in the Seacoast of the 3 Seacoast communities, Portsmouth, Dover, Rochester, because in 1974, their housing was the most deplorable.
Which is interesting, to point out, because people often forget just looking at where we are today.
Right.
And not just Portsmouth. We can look at how much Dover has changed too, right?
Absolutely.
These were different communities in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Right.
So
right.
Another item that generated some discussion on the council's agenda was the Recovery Residence Grant on Avon Avenue. And I think it's important to point out that it was before the city council because the city essentially is the vehicle for accepting the grant that will allow this to operate. This will be managed by the Dover Housing Authority, and the operator, I believe, is SOS.
Right. And Fairtide, which is a housing agency out of Maine, they are assisting as well. They drafted most of the grant language. The planning department helped facilitate getting it through our process. But as the manager said, and I think as you and I have talked about on the podcast before, this is a scenario where we were able to provide a linkage, meaning we are eligible for the funding, but the Housing Authority and Fairtide are not. So through an arrangement of support, we are applying for the grant. Should we get the grant, it would be immediately passed through to DHA, and DHA would be responsible for making sure there's enough funding for the project they want to do, actually managing the project, doing the project, et cetera. And you're right. I think SOS and Fairtide have been their partners in that along the way. But our primary partner would be DHA. And the relationship really is going to be similar to the CDBG, which we were just talking about, where they're a subrecipient. They are going to sign a program agreement that says, here's the reporting that we're required to do, and you are required to give it to us. And I think, too, one of the things that came out when the council discussed it was this understanding that should there not be enough funding, meaning should the project come in over the grant funds, DHA is responsible for raising that and not to come back to the city and say, hey, you're our partner, help us get the funding.
Well, let's look at the planning board. I know one of the significant action items for the planning board, at least at their meeting on the 10th, was the adoption of the land use chapter of the master plan.
Yeah.
You obviously have a lot to say about the master plan. This is one of the more significant chapters of the master plan.
Absolutely. The land use chapter and the vision chapter are the only two required under state law if you are going to have zoning and a capital improvements program. And I would venture that 80% of communities that have master plans just have those two chapters, and they're typically billed as one chapter. Here, we separate the vision so that it is its own chapter that sort of sets the umbrella tone for everything. And then Director Benton and her team, working with the steering committee, have created the first land use chapter since 2014. I was telling her as I was reviewing it that it was interesting for me because when I first came on board with the city in 1997, the first thing I worked on was the land use chapter from 1997. And then we redid it in 2007. And then 2014 was that time, the last time. And that's the one that we just replaced.
And they're already at work on the next chapter.
Right, the transportation chapter, which I know they've had interviews. And I believe probably on the 11th of March, they will be looking to award a bid to the consultant to do that project.
In other planning board news, one of those was to increase the density on Monroe Street, which has an affordable housing component to it, I believe.
Right. So they're trying to take a small lot, Monroe Street. They're all small cottage-style lots, and the applicant is looking to have 4 units total where there's currently 1. And so there's a combination of what's the right density, but also utilization of the lot. How do you park on it? How do you do some of these other things? Because you can't park on the street on Monroe Street because, like the lots and the homes, it's small. So that's an interesting conundrum for the board. They also granted a conditional use permit for 99 Knox Marsh Road, which has proposed 160 units of low-income tax credit or LIHTC housing and 25,000 square feet of commercial under the residential commercial mixed use overlay district. My understanding is the conditional use permit was applauded, meaning that the board unanimously approved it and that there was really no pushback. There were some questions that will be fleshed out during the site plan review because that's part 2.
Right.
But overall, this will be the largest single project, not the largest project, but the largest single project of low-income housing, not public housing, mind you, but housing geared towards folks that are in that missing link between public housing that's offered, but also the true market rate housing that'll fluctuate. This will be housing that's geared towards low-mod residents.
That's a significant project. Another one that they considered was the mixed-use development on Mechanic Street, which is an interesting one. That's a 5-story building.
Almost on a lot as tight as Monroe Street.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah, it's a very tight space, and it's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
For sure.
It's following what started at the corner of Chapel and Mechanic, which is a mixed-use commercial on the first floor, residential above. It's right adjacent to that project. Yeah. And my understanding is that the board didn't really flinch at the project per se, but again, flinched at how it fits on the lot and had some of the same concerns that I think the technical review committee had at times of how do you actually park? How does it actually function? If you have a winter like this winter, where do you put the snow? How do you deal with the dumpsters? All of those good questions that they focus on at the planning board.
Yep.
I think we are known as a community that wants development. We just don't want development crammed down our throats. We want it to be realistic and reasonable.
Moving on to the school board. The school board had only one meeting in February, and there wasn't a lot on their agenda. They, of course, have already gone through their budget process. They had started that back in November. Maybe one of the more significant items on their agenda was the first reading of a policy to address generative AI, artificial intelligence. This is something that all schools are dealing with, some more than others. Certainly at the high school level, they're seeing a lot more use of artificial intelligence.
So this is geared towards the students using it, not the staff using it.
Actually, the policy will address not only the students' use of AI, but the staff's use as well. There's a lot still to work out in that policy and how they're going to approach that. But the board had some pretty interesting discussion about where we are now, because there's an acknowledgement that students and staff, for that matter, are already using generative AI, and that genie is out of the bottle, so to speak. So,
recently I saw a video on YouTube where a college TA was showing how the professor requires submission through Google Docs because then they use Gemini to grade the papers.
Yep.
And that somehow, and it was above my pay grade to figure out how, but somehow they're able to, through an algorithm, tell the AI to identify how much of the paper was written by the student, how much was AI driven, how many edits were done, who did the edits, like all of these things that just crazy to think about. But the funny thing is they were talking about it from the standpoint of students shouldn't use AI to draft papers, but then they're using AI to grade the papers.
There was some discussion about that even at the school board level. There is, I think, an understanding now that AI can be used, generative AI can be used as a tool. And if it's used responsibly, there is a place for it, certainly in the classroom, but in society in general. I think the city probably will be at some point looking at a more formal policy for how it uses AI as well.
So the city manager has asked me to head up a team, probably you, probably someone from IT, a couple others, to look at that. It's on my March to-do list, actually.
Yeah, but that's a conversation that is certainly not going away. And it's probably also important to point out when we're
talking podcast is AI and we're not real.
Well, you know what? It's actually, this is a great example because we don't always equate AI with some of the things that it does that we just take for granted. Now, that could include this podcast in the sense when we talk about cleaning up audio. If we've got noise or something, we're using some AI tools to help do that, which do nothing more than save time from having to do that. It was a very cumbersome process, and it still can be, but AI and there are tools within the audio and video platforms that we use that can help us do that a little bit easier than we did in the past. And that's using artificial intelligence, obviously. So it is in many applications that people use without even knowing it.
Absolutely. There was a discussion that I was part of maybe 2 years ago. I went to a conference and sat in on 2 sessions about AI, and they started listing off things that today we would consider AI dating back to the 50s.
Yep.
Just some different iterations, different technology, but the same sort of concept of someone making a decision for you and providing that result.
Well, that conversation will continue. That was the first reading of the policy for the school board, so that will be back for a subsequent reading and maybe multiple readings, but we'll see. In other news, and briefly, I'll just touch upon the Dover High School athletic complex. The JBC met once in February. Not a lot to discuss there. Obviously, work is still underway in the winter, despite the cold and snowy conditions. They have still been able to keep working out there. They have also made some design decisions, including on the field markings and fence padding, and also some of the technology that's going to be connected to the press box. So that's all exciting to see. That's coming along. Obviously, City Councilor Fergus Cullen is the chair of that committee, and they continue to meet and are hoping to keep this moving despite what has been a pretty cold winter.
Speaking of the cold winter and its impact on site projects, the waterfront, while still in a very positive position in the sense of progress made, we did have a little bit of impact this past month on the pavilion, which was supposed to be wrapped up the first week of the month. But as you'll recall, between snow and extreme cold, it hasn't worked out that way. And right now we're in a pause position because there are elements, painting, caulking, things of that nature that really need a warmer temperature, at least not going down freezing during the day. And so the roof is on. A lot of I think it's like 95% done, really. We've had punch list walkthroughs, things of that nature. It's just coming down to that. Similar on the actual site work on Nebby Park, the bulkhead work has been extremely well received. Northeast Earth and their subcontractor that does actual granite wall work really is making great progress, but we can't finish the pavilion plaza until weather and or 3 feet of snow do not exist on the site. So that's one of those. I think March will carry forward the same kind of update of nothing's happening, but come April we'll really see a resumption when the weather is in a much better position.
And the Community Waterfront Development Advisory Committee did meet, obviously, in February. But we are getting to the point where we are seeing this project come to a close. Not immediately, but we are seeing sort of the end in sight.
Yeah, I anticipate that hopefully mid-April we'll have a sense for when we can publicize the opening of Nebby Park.
Yeah.
I think that we had hoped for Memorial Day. That was prior to needing to do the bulkhead work, and it's kind of drifted into June at this point. I am just using early July because that's a safe understanding now. And it's not for lack of trying. It's really this weather-dependent work that needs to be completed. You can't put down the final top coat of pavement on River Street at this point. So, and there's the raised crosswalks and the street trees and stuff like that really need to be accomplished, and we'll get there when we can get there.
Any other meetings, Chris, that you wanted to cover?
The only other thing I participated in, we mentioned that the TIF at the workshop, both TIF boards met and reviewed the situation of each district. The TIF boards, there are 2 of them, 1 per board. They usually meet in the fall and then again in the winter, every 6 months or so. And the goal in the fall is to adopt a financial prognosis that is actually then reported to the state per statutory requirements. The winter one, the one we had in February, that is more of a update, a prognostication. The finance director comes and says, here's what we're seeing. Gives a little bit of a heads up. So both boards met and had a good old time. The downtown TIF really, as you mentioned earlier, is kind of at that crossroads of what do we do with ourselves. So we'll see from that. Also, I attended the Parking Commission meeting on February 17th. It was a pretty low-key meeting for them. The most part, they reviewed the budget that the city manager had proposed because the Parking Activity Fund is part of that budget. And they had some conversation about the downtown TIF because they are part of the downtown TIF funding formula. And then they had some conversation about general development activities that we're seeing because there are a few, not a lot, but a few projects that are dependent on parking permits as opposed to providing their own park.
And also briefly, just wanted to mention that Mayor Dennis Shanahan has started in February his conversation with a mayor sessions. He's holding these twice a month at City Hall in the council conference room. And this is open to anyone to come in and chat with the mayor about anything on their mind. And they're typically about 90 minutes long. So watch for the dates for the upcoming March sessions soon.
I think we pretty much covered February. I won't say in a nutshell. And I look forward to having this conversation again in March with you.
All right, me too. We'll see you then.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.